We've often heard this refrain that urbanization is over the top, that it was time to undo it. We look to answer two questions. Can urbanization be undone or halted? And how many cities in India are needed? But first things first, let us start with understanding what are the antecedents of urbanization and what are its consequences. In this study, we touch upon four main aspects. Number one, we look at the big rush of population worldwide and in India. Number two, we look at the irreversibility of urbanization through the eyes of three main economic factors. Number three, we look at the real estate, its pressures and its outcome and its needs. And finally, at number four, we look at the number of new cities that might be needed in India. Celebrated author Dan Brown, in his Inferno, mentions the graph that you're about to see. Look closely, you'll be interested. From AD 1000 till about 1550, the global population was at about 500 million people. In the next 300 years, however, it doubled to 1 billion people. In another 100 years, it doubled yet again to 2 billion people. It became 4 billion people in less than a century from there. At 7.2 billion today, we are close to doubling the previous count. No wonder celebrated authors find a plot here. Closer home, India and China have been leading the world population growth for the last 70 odd years. China's population growth is slowing and perhaps will start declining 2030 onwards. India, however, will continue to rise for some more years. Let's take a quick look at the rising urban population in India. So what is the suspense behind the rising urban populations? Is it worth trying to stop it? Shall we go back to villages? Presented here is a threefold economic reasoning and perspective. Reasoning number one, urbanized economies create more prosperity per person. Mind you, this is not really in relevance to the country's strength of GDP. Reasoning number two, rural economies prove less effective in harnessing people's full potential. Conversely, urban economies are more effective in utilizing people's capacities. Economic reasoning number three, by moving from primary to secondary and tertiary sectors, individual incomes move by 5 to 10 times. Okay, let's start demonstrating each of those. For the first one, we start with doing a countries versus citizens prosperity comparison to demonstrate how urban economies provide greater prosperities for citizens. I pick up 10 countries randomly. They're here. Most of them are developing economies, and most of them are Asia-Pacific economies. The two developed economies are New Zealand and Japan, for exceptions, and also Argentina and Brazil, which are non-Asia Pacific. So, we have Malaysia, India, China, Argentina, New Zealand, Brazil, Japan, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. We start by comparing their GDP components, that is, agricultural component of GDP, industrial and services components of GDP. And we also look at per person income in these countries. You notice that 15% line, right? I made it just to check which countries depend more than 15% on agriculture for their overall GDPs. Countries that depend more on agriculture have people whose annual incomes are in the lowest band. India, Pakistan, Vietnam and Sri Lanka in this group. China and Brazil in this group are marginally ahead in terms of their per capita incomes, but they also rely a little less on agriculture than the other four. Even lower reliance on agriculture in their GDPs, Malaysia and Argentina are placed somewhere in between in terms of their per capita per annum incomes. Agriculture contributes just about 5% to New Zealand's GDP, and its per person income is supremely high. Just 1% of Japan's GDP is made up of agriculture, and its individual citizen is the richest of all. Two of the most powerful countries or economies in this group have citizens who are quite poor. New Zealand, Malaysia, Argentina and Japan do not top in terms of their country's power, but their citizens are definitely more prosperous. Isn't it evident that certain countries like India and China are rich countries of poor people, primarily because they still depend a lot on rural economies? Let us look at the economic reasoning number 2, which is the disparity in how the GDP load is borne by two different parts of the economy. Have a look at the total proportion of population living in rural areas and the amount of GDP that agriculture contributes. Conversely, this also means that the remaining population in urban areas takes the burden of the secondary and tertiary contribution to the economies. In India, 34% people produce 83% of the country's GDP. Pretty much the same in other countries like China, Pakistan, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, where small urban populations contribute much bigger GDP proportions. To set certain doubts to rest, we don't mean to say that rural people do not do enough work. Neither do we say that agriculture is not required. We only mean to say that there are surplus rural people who must reskill and re-engage in secondary and tertiary pursuits in urban areas. And now the logic number 3, the pull of incomes. The biggest reason why urbanization is irreversible. Let us now compare personal incomes from agricultural and non-agricultural work in these different countries. These are agricultural incomes, and these are agricultural compared with non-agricultural incomes in these countries. The blue markers represent the number of times income changes when somebody engages in a non-agricultural work in these countries. India, China, Pakistan, Vietnam are those where incomes increase by 5 to 10 times. Japan can be ignored because it has a very small proportion of population working in agriculture. In short, reskilling and relocating from rural to urban areas to participate in secondary or tertiary sectors is important, as it will increase incomes manifold. The biggest compelling reason, therefore, is that individual incomes will increase manifold by locating from rural to urban areas. Alright, so let's now do India-specific assessments. India has attained about 32% urbanization, which is about 410 million people living in urban areas. There is empirical evidence that the rate of urbanization is usually slow till it reaches 30%, but it picks up tremendous speed after that, till it reaches about 65%. India, by various estimates, needs massive investments to make everything happen. And mark the year 2030, when the urban population may become 600 million. To have a yardstick, we use the top 8 cities of economic activity and urban development, which are these. So if India failed to create new urban options, then prepare for at least a very noisy and crowded place. After accommodating various other factors, it can be safely assumed that about 50 to 70 square feet of office space per household is a good ratio for a city. But here, look at some of the major Indian cities. Except Bangalore and Pune, they have abysmal ratios, which means they can't sustain too many. So if there are no new city options in the next 15-20 years, these cities will have to have many more office spaces, as shown in the orange bars. Each of them may have to increase its office space by 1.5 times. Look how some of the global cities fare. Despite heavy densities, cities like London, Tokyo, Singapore, and even Bangalore are quite fairly balanced. The bars on extreme left show the housing stock that exists in these cities as on date, while the bars on extreme right, the orange bars, show the additional housing that must be created to house the additional population that will come in the next 15 to 20 years. Remember, what exists was created over a period of 200 to 300 years. Are we good enough to recreate the same thing in another 20 years is the fundamental question. It's alright to do mathematics and statistics, but that will not solve the problem. The only answer is creating new cities. The final remaining question is, how many of those? These are no jokes here. We may have to repeat a Bangalore 50 times, a Mumbai 15 times, and so on. Task and challenge of creating new cities is now, not 20 years later. It only matters if we are awake to it.